Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange. Today I'm here to bring you a recommendation video for adult science fiction. I have previously done a video recommending where to start with science fiction if you are a newbie, and the video is a couple years old now, but all the books still hold up, so definitely recommend checking that out if you're new to the genre. And then I also did a previous recommendation video that is going to be formatted similarly to this one. And in that video and also in this one, I'm going to be recommending books for different levels of experience with the genre. So I'm going to have books for beginners as well as intermediate and what I call advanced science fiction readers. I just really like organizing my videos this way. It really works with my mind and the way that I like to think about books. So I hope you find this format helpful, and hopefully you find some books that are interesting to you at the reading levels that you are looking for if you want to challenge yourself or just looking for something really easy to get into. I think that's all I gotta say, so let's get into the actual book recommendations. First, let's start with the beginner category, and I really do mean that. These are books that you can pick up if you are brand new to the genre. This could be the first book you're picking up or the second or third, but these are very accessible and really good entry points into the genre. And so for a lot of times, I like to recommend space opera because I think that it's really easy to read. It doesn't tend to have a lot of hard science fiction, meaning that it doesn't have a lot of basis in true science. Instead, these books tend to be very character focused and very action focused, and often they follow very similar narratives to things that you would see in movies like Star Wars, where they are very epic in scale. Typically, these books follow a small group of people that are pulled into an epic plot. So the space opera that I want to recommend here is Roboteer by Alex Lamb. This is the first book in a trilogy, and you can read it just as a standalone or continue on with the later books because each of them jump forward in time. It follows a young man named Will who has some technology built into his body. Basically, he is what is called a roboteer in this world, meaning that he can connect directly with technology and interface with it that way. This is set in a future where there is a group of people back on Earth that are pushing against this futuristic technology and wanting Earth people to go back to the more natural ways. And at the beginning of the story, the main character Will discovers some old ancient alien technology, and that really creates some epic scale excitement and adventure with him and his crewmates. So this is a very classic space opera narrative. You'll hear a lot of these books have involvement of ancient technology, and I just think that it's a really good introduction to space opera, and it's just very straightforward. The characters are very easy to understand in terms of their motivations, and the larger political work in the book also I thought was very straightforward. If anything, it's a little bit simplistic just to have these ideological people that are just pushing against the future of technology. It's kind of a cliche, but I do think that it's something that very much could and does exist. And so I think it's very easy to get into, and again, a really good entry point, because a lot of times people like myself who read a lot of the genre will say this is space opera. And if you haven't read space opera before, you may not know what that. The books are relatively chunky if you look at the page number, but the writing tends to be quite large in terms of the font. And again, it's a kind of book that you can actually just read the first book, or if you choose to, like I did, you'll continue on and read the later ones. But definitely want to recommend. I think it's very easy to get into with good characters, a lot of action, and while there is some technology with the roboteering, it's explained in very simple terms and very easy to understand. So don't be turned off by that. It's a really good way to kind of dip your toes in the genre. Next, also in the beginner category, I want to recommend Stormblood by Jeremy Saul, and this is more of a cyberpunk noir, so a little bit of a different genre, but again, a kind of narrative that you'll find a lot of times in science fiction. So I think this book is a really good entry point if you want to try out something that's more on the cyberpunk side of things, because this one reads more like a thriller. This is set in a future where there are super soldiers that are created by infusing them with ancient technology from another alien race. You'll see a lot of common themes in these beginner books. And this Stormblood basically allows them to have enhanced abilities. So think of them as being stronger, faster. And this makes them really good soldiers, and so they were very effective during a war that they had to fight. However, you find out after the war is done that they have a lot of trouble coping and just getting reintroduced to society because they basically become addicted to the adrenaline rush they get by using their Stormblood abilities. And so we get to follow one man who is trying to adjust to that, and he is living his life and so forth and just trying to move on from all of that. But he gets pulled back into a plot when he finds out that other super soldiers are getting killed off. So this is more of a mystery thriller where you're trying to figure out who the big baddies are and who is basically behind this plot. So if you're looking for a book that has a lot of action and adventure, this is a great one to check out. I describe it as a thriller, so if you read more thrillers and are just looking for that science fiction element, this one is definitely up your alley. And it does involve this Stormblood technology, but the reason I want to put it in the beginner category is that it's always explained in really simple terms. So the author really takes the time to explain how it works, how it affects them, and it's introduced very early, so you get a lot of information. You really get to go point by point how everything works out. And so I really appreciate that the author took the time to really walk the reader through how the technology works, because again, I think it makes it so much more accessible. I remember being a newer reader myself and finding it very frustrating when authors would almost gatekeep the genre by making it impossible to understand what was going on and making me feel pretty dumb. So I think that this is a really good place to just jump in. You will get a fast-paced story. While this book is quite long and is the start of a series, it's so action-packed. The plot is constantly moving forward, and again, it's done in a really accessible way. So if you like those kind of movies, you will love this. It very much has that like Blade Runner style to it. So definitely recommend to any beginners or just someone looking for a really fun cyberpunk. This is a great one to check out. Now, moving on to the intermediate category, I want to recommend Lock In by John Scalzi. This is set in a future where there is a disease that has broken out and affected a large portion of the population. It has caused people's body to become comatose or frozen so that they cannot move. However, their minds are still intact and are still fully functioning. So in order to let these people basically exist and be part of society again, there are these robotic bodies that are created that allow them to take their minds and just function in society and have their minds exist in this other place while their actual physical body is lying in a hospital bed. So that is a setup for the world. And the specific story follows an FBI agent, Chris, that is just starting on the force. And in this story, there is a mystery because someone in a very important position has been murdered. And so they are going around and trying to solve the case. Now, the reason I'm putting this in the intermediate category is for the world building. I know for some people that don't read a lot of science fiction, they did find it to be very confusing. I do want to mention that there is a novella that you can read that gives a bit more explanation of the backstory, and I know for other people they did find that helpful, so you could consider reading that before going into this one, especially if you're someone who's maybe a beginner but this book just sounds really good and you want to try it out. So in terms of the world building, it's not the most complicated by any means, and the author does take the time to explain how it works, but it's just not the simplest concepts. I definitely haven't read a lot of science fiction books that take that same idea. I've seen similar ideas, but nothing quite like it, which again makes it really unique and for me very interesting. I do want to mention that while this definitely is science fiction, it also is a book that reads like a police procedural because you really do have the main character going around looking for clues, interviewing people, and trying to find the murderers. So this is a science fiction book that I recommend to any of you like myself that really enjoy a good mystery. So you have to enjoy that piece. But if you do already enjoy mysteries and are looking to segue into science fiction, this is a really good stepping stone book. And I just thought it was really fascinating. It has some good humor in it, and the author does some really interesting things with gender because you'll notice that the main character, Chris, is actually never identified as either male or female and are, even possibly non-binary, and you just do not know. And I thought that was a really interesting piece and just made for some really interesting commentary. So definitely want to recommend. There's also a sequel, Head On, which I've read and really enjoyed as well. So definitely one that I think is worth checking out. Also in the intermediate category, I want to recommend a trilogy that starts with VN, the second book is ID, and the third one is Rev. The first book is set in a future where humans have created these synthetic synthetic artificial intelligence that they call VN. They are typically designed to be companion robots. And so the story follows a young VN who is just a girl at the beginning of the story. Her parents, one is a human and the other one is a VN like herself. And she is slowly growing up. However, there is an incident that happens and her mother is in danger because her grandmother shows up. So in order to protect her mother, she decides to eat her grandmother. And this is troublesome for a few reasons. One being the fact that in this situation, humans are put in danger. And in this future, there are what are called fail-safes, meaning that every VN has a switch that is designed to go off if they ever cause harm to a human or allow harm to happen in front of them. And so the fail switch in our main character Amy does not go off, and so at the beginning of the story she ends up on the run for her life because the government wants to bring her in, see what went wrong, and possibly turn her off for good. This is a more complex artificial intelligence story, which is why I felt I definitely had to put it in the intermediate category. This book is just a little bit different than any AI story I've read before, and you can tell just from the synopsis that it takes a little bit to explain, and it's a very kooky story that's a little bit offbeat. At the core of it, like I said, you have a girl on the run, so it is a familiar enough narrative that I didn't consider this book to be advanced. I do think it is accessible to a point. However, I feel like there's enough complex ideas introduced that it's a book that is better consumed once you have your footing in the genre, so I would recommend reading some science fiction books first, specifically some artificial intelligence stories that are a little bit more easy to get into before stepping into this one. You get to find out about iteration, which means that while they are synthetic, they are able to reproduce, and they reproduce by eating lots, which is why the main character Amy actually is able to eat her grandmother, and by doing so she actually starts to grow up. So this is also a coming of age story, and in the later books, as I mentioned, because it is a complete trilogy, you do get to see how the characters grow and how the story moves along in the larger political ramifications. But I definitely recommend this one to anyone that is intrigued by the plot. There's a lot of good character work, a lot of action. It's very fast-paced, but at the same time, the author is very intelligent as a writer. She is a futurist and really builds those ideas into her stories. And I really love this one, so I feel like I'm constantly recommending it, but it's for a good reason. I hope you check it out. Now, moving on to the advanced category. And before I get into the recommendations, I always want to preface this by saying that these are books that I consider for readers that I call advanced, which is a very, very subjective term. So I consider someone an advanced reader when they are well established in the science fiction genre, when they can comfortably pick up kind of any science fiction book they want and get through it without feeling stuck or overly confused, or at least more confused than the author intended. And so for some of you, you might be looking at these books and saying they're not that complicated, or I've read more complicated things than that. So it's not a competition, and so keep that in mind. And so these are books that I think are the most complex on this list, and so I'm putting them in this final category. The first book I want to talk about is Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson, which is a cyberpunk novel that is a bit of a satire on the subgenre, and it follows a main character called Hero Protagonist, who is a hacker but also a pizza delivery boy. And in this world there is a virtual reality where most of the story takes place, and the character is offered what is called Snow Crash, which appears to be some sort of virus, and the story really goes from there. It's a hard one to summarize, but the reason I want to put this in the advanced category is the fact that I think it's one that's best appreciated once you have a good foundation in the subgenre of cyberpunk. And so I do recommend reading books like Neuromancer first in order to really appreciate this one, because like I said, this is a bit of a satire on the subgenre itself, so it's really good to know where these books started and where those ideas are coming from. It's a little bit goofy, it's very over the top, and and ridiculous. And so you definitely have to suspend your disbelief and just go into it with a really open mind. It's very kooky, and while it was written in the 90s, it's already kind of become a modern classic. So again, definitely want to check out. I do think if you're newer to this subgenre, you can still enjoy this book, but I think you'll get a lot more out of it if you've read quite a bit of cyberpunk. So one I definitely recommend. It's an interesting one for sure, a lot of fun, and definitely explores a lot of deep ideas. Neil Stephenson is known for really including a lot of hard science fiction in his stories, and that's why this book is hard to summarize, because this book explores so many ideas within the larger plot, discussions of language and virtual reality, and I just found myself just rereading paragraphs, being really fascinated by the ideas that he was bringing up. So definitely one I would recommend. I would encourage you to wait till you're really comfortable in the genre just so that you get the most out of the story, but definitely one you don't want to miss. Finally, in the advanced category, I want to recommend The Quantum Thief. I'm not going to say the author's name because I do not want to butcher it, but this is the first book in a series that follows a man who is both a thief and also acts like a detective. This is set in a future where humans are now living on Mars, and we follow this person who is incredibly interesting as an individual. At the beginning of the story, he is invited to go to solve the mystery of a chocolatier who has been murdered, and so he has to investigate and use his powers of deduction to find out what is going on. That is just the start of the story, and then it goes on from there. So it gives the beginnings of a mystery, but it's really more about the character himself. And like I said, he's very interesting. I think he is the reason to read it. In some ways, he's a little bit deadpan of a character. He's very serious, but at the same time, I was very much intrigued by him. Clearly, the author was inspired by the character of Sherlock, because this character shares a lot of his abilities for deduction and is just pulled into a mystery and is just able to look at little details and pick them up. So I really enjoyed those aspects to it. The reason I want to put this book in the advanced category is, I'll be honest, while I enjoyed this book, a lot of it did go over my head. I think that this book will appeal most to people that have a background in quantum theory, which I do not. And it's definitely a book that I'd like to revisit one day once I have more footing in the science behind it. This book explores some really interesting ideas of memory and privacy. In this world, there's technology that allows people to control how much about them you can know or not know. So basically, you can choose to enable or disable this feature, and that will allow you to know my name, where I live, and more about me, or I can keep that all very private. And I think in today's age, where so much of technology is about sharing and possibly oversharing online and on social media, I think this book is really topical. And again, it's just really fascinating. So if you're someone who likes a really good character study, but also some really complex ideas that are going to bend your mind, hopefully in really good ways, this is definitely one to check out. This is the most complex book that I put on this list, so it's why I wanted to save it till last. So please do yourself a favor and make sure you're really comfortable with science fiction in general before you go into this one. But once you are there, it's definitely one that's worth working your way up to, and I do hope you check it out for yourself. So that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know down below, what level of science fiction reader are you? Would you consider yourself a beginner, intermediate, or advanced? And of the books I mentioned, which ones are you most interested in checking out for yourself? Let me know if you enjoyed a recommendation video like this format, because I would love to do this on a more regular basis. As I mentioned, I've done this before with science fiction, so I'll include that video down below, as well as one I did for the fantasy genre. So links to those if you want even more recommendations. There are no repeats on those lists. Otherwise, please consider subscribing if you're new here. I do read a lot of adult science fiction as well as fantasy, horror, and thrillers. If you are not so new, please still drop a comment, give this video a thumbs up, and share it around online. It really helps me out. Thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.